Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Captive of Wing and Feather, a retelling of Swan Lake, by Melanie Cellier, narrated by Esther Wane. Part 1. The Lake. Prologue. I stumbled, my feet tripping over dead branches and leaf litter. My heart pounded harder than my steps, although no one was chasing me. A sweet, clear taste lingered in my mouth, but it elicited only dread. The lake had been beautiful, and the swans floating on it even more so, but I never wanted to see any of it again. I never wanted to see that man again, or hear him spout such madness. I refused to believe his talk of enchantments. I should never have followed the sound of my name. I should have listened to the townsfolk and stayed away from the forest. It had been foolishness to try to prove I wasn't afraid of it, even while nameless dread circled in my stomach. I burst out of the trees and onto the edge of town. Just as my feet touched the road, I faltered, a burning, stinging sensation washing over my body. My hands pressed against my exposed skin, but it was gone almost as quickly as it had come. A flash of white overhead made me flinch. Had that been a swan? I shook my head and kept my eyes resolutely down. It didn't matter what it had been. I was returning to the haven, and I would never enter the forest again. Chapter 1. 2 years later. An air of excitement hung over the town. A newcomer might not have noticed it, but I could feel it like a palpable presence around me. I'd spent enough time in Brierley over the past 5 years to recognize its moods. I glanced longingly at the various small knots of townsfolk talking on street corners and scattered around the market square. But there was no point stopping and trying to talk to any of them. Instead, I moved faster, hurrying for the sprawling lodge house on the edge of town. My path took me past the bakery, where I would usually receive a greeting or at least a wave. But on this occasion the young baker, Ash, seemed just as distracted as everyone else. He was deep in conversation with 2 older women who showed no inclination to leave, despite the fresh loaves already poking from their baskets. As I passed by, I caught a snatch of their conversation. "But what purpose could he have?" The woman sounded worried. "Perhaps we're suspected of some sort of wrongdoing. Treason, even." The second woman sounded even more concerned. Ash, who was usually fairly sensible, made no effort to gainsay this outrageous statement. "If you ask me, the best thing we can do is nothing," he said. "If he wishes to pretend that his visit is nothing out of the ordinary, then we must do the same. Perhaps he'll—" He trailed off, as if even he didn't know what he hoped would happen, but both women nodded their agreement. I realized my steps had almost completely stilled, and, shaking my head, I picked up my pace. If I wanted answers, my best hope was Cora. I wouldn't get anything from this group. The dilapidated building, once an inn but now known to most of us as the Haven, came into view, and my speed increased again. A brisk spring breeze nearly blew back my hood, and I grabbed at it just in time. I had an odd reputation around town, and with everyone so stirred up, I didn't want to invite trouble. I pushed open the main door without knocking, and looked around for Cora, the Haven's keeper. Instead, a 4-year-old girl came barreling into view, an excited grin on her face. "Lady!" She raced toward me. "Lady, lady, lady!" I hoisted her up onto my hip and paused for a moment to give her a cuddle. Unlike the townsfolk, Juniper didn't care that I had no voice. I wanted to savour these moments while I still could. She would be too big for it soon. Already she seemed less and less of a baby, or long legs and waving arms. "I made muffins, all by myself, and you can have one. And I got a new tooth, right at the back, see?" She opened her jaws wide and tipped her head back to an angle that completely obscured her mouth. I suppressed a smile and adopted an astonished and impressed expression. She paused for only a moment before snapping her teeth closed and continuing to prattle on, unbothered by my silence. When she began to squirm, I let her slip back down to the ground. She took my hand and tugged me down the long hallway into the large kitchen at the back of the lodge. Clearly, Juniper didn't know about whatever had the townsfolk so worked up. She would have blurted it out to me first thing if she did. I felt a surge of unease. The people of Brierley had a tendency to get worried about every tiny thing, but Cora and Wren were usually a little more sensible. If they felt the need to shield Juniper from what was happening, then perhaps it truly was a cause for concern. "Junie, there you are!" A young woman hurried into the room, her eyes fixed on her daughter. "I thought I told you to stay in the—" Her eyes fell on me. "Oh, lady, you've arrived. That would explain it, then." The disapproving look she had fixed on her daughter didn't relent, but the girl let go of my hand and ran happily to her mother anyway. She rushed through an almost unintelligible sentence from which I caught the word muffin. Wren's expression dissolved into a reluctant smile, and she nodded. Juniper ran off toward the far bench where I could see a cooling rack filled with muffins. Wren gave me an apologetic look. "I hope you're hungry. She won't relax until you've had one, I'm afraid. I needed an excuse to be out of the classroom this morning, and Juniper has been begging me to do some baking with her." I gave her an inquiring look. "Frank and Selina are nearly old enough for apprenticeships now, and they're both outdoing each other trying to prove how reliable they are. So I've been wanting to give them a chance to take charge of the younger ones." She chuckled. "Juniper was a little too eager to escape her schooling, but she's still young. I wouldn't even have started her at it yet if I wasn't responsible for the older children as well." I smiled to indicate my willingness to become a muffin taster, and slipped onto one of the stools surrounding the enormous worn wooden table that filled the middle of the kitchen. Wren and Juniper had been at the Haven for more than 3 years now, and I knew that she took her role of teacher to the Haven's children seriously. Her attention for them hadn't wavered, despite their numbers being low this year, Cora having found adoptive families for 3 of the younger ones only a few months ago, and 2 of the older ones having left for apprenticeships that she had secured. Normally, at least some new children would have arrived to replace them, but we'd been seeing fewer and fewer people making their way to the Haven from distant towns. Travel all across the kingdom had been dropping from all reports. I was glad Wren was getting a small break, and perhaps she could answer my question. Glancing toward Juniper, I confirmed she was still busy selecting the perfect muffin. When I looked back at Wren, it was with a raised eyebrow and an inquiring tilt of my head. When she didn't immediately seem to understand, I jerked my head toward the front door and the rest of town. Adopting an exaggerated expression of concern, I mimed my best impression of the townsfolk I had passed. A woman several decades our senior, her hair in no-nonsense braids against her scalp, entered the room just in time to witness my performance. She snorted a laugh. "Are you sure you're not a long-lost member of my family? You look exactly like my old Aunt Florinda. She wore an expression just like that every day of her life." Wren chuckled. Only my brown hair, thick and wavy, looked anything like Cora's, and since she always wore hers in braids, even that wasn't much of a similarity. Certainly my pale skin and blue eyes looked nothing like the warm brown of hers. I smiled as well, but inside I hid a sigh. I knew every branch of my family tree, tracing back multiple generations. My father had insisted on it. There was no chance I had any relatives half as down-to-earth and kind as Cora. I would have to content myself with being adopted into the Haven's strange family in heart, if not in actuality. When Wren's humour subsided, I made a series of hand gestures that produced a sigh from Cora, her face falling into more serious lines. Juniper trotted back toward us before she could reply, however, proudly bearing a muffin on a little plate which she placed before me. "What are you talking about?" She looked between us all. "Nothing that concerns you," said Wren. "Lady has her muffin now, so why don't you get back to your letters?" She sent a stern eye toward the abandoned slate on a small, child-sized table tucked into the corner of the room. I could just make out a single misshaped S scratched across its surface. "But—" Juniper began to protest, only to cut herself off when she saw her mother's unyielding expression. With a large, dramatic sigh, she hung her head and shuffled off toward the small table and chair. I bit my lip, trying to hold in a laugh. Wren rolled her eyes. "Anyone would think I was the cruelest of mothers." Cora raised an eyebrow. "I can't imagine where she gets the dramatics from." Wen laughed, her eyes lingering on her daughter, but gradually the humour dropped from her face. "She does seem like Audrey, doesn't she?" I abandoned my muffin to put a reassuring hand on her arm, despite the stab of pain in my midriff at the mention of Wren's sister. "She'll be back when she's ready," Cora said in a calm tone. Audrey was 16, 2 years younger than me and 7 years younger than Wen, who often treated her like another daughter. She had told me once that older siblings couldn't help taking on that role when they lost their parents too young. I had refrained from observing that not all older siblings reacted in such a manner. For 5 years I had refused to mention my home, my family, or even my kingdom. It was habit now as much as intention. Wren's mothering had irritated Audrey at times, but I knew that underneath she loved it. And you only had to look at Juniper to see what a wonderful mother Wen made. But I knew she blamed herself for Audrey's departure. They had fought the night before she left, and it ate her up inside that Audrey hadn't been back even once for a visit in the 6 months since she went to work up at the local castle. I was the only one who knew there was more to the story, but I didn't dare tell Wen. Cora met my eyes silently, and my hand dropped from Wren's arm. I returned to my muffin, keeping my face hidden from my friend. Cora didn't know the whole story either, but I knew she had at least some suspicions about the castle, and we had a tacit agreement not to mention anything about them to Wen. Wen thought Cora's antipathy toward Lord Leander was solely because he didn't send supplies to assist the residents of the Haven, as his father always used to do. Better that she believed her sister still angry with her than that she worry herself about something worse. Not when there was nothing she could do about it, except get into trouble herself. Once I had finished Junie's treat, I flapped my hands to capture both of the other women's attention, and re-signed my question to Cora. Wen looked between us with a raised eyebrow. She had learned some of my more common hand signals, but only Cora fully understood the makeshift communication system she and I had cobbled together. "So you notice the townsfolk are getting themselves all tied up in knots, I take it?" Cora's voice held enough exasperation to allay the worst of my fears. "It is concerning, though." Wen kept her voice low, casting a warning glance toward Juniper, who had abandoned her slate and was crouched down on the floor of the kitchen, closely examining a small bug. "Why is he here, of all places? And why is he trying to hide who he is?" I gave them both a look of exasperation. They were as bad as Ash and his customers. I made an impatient gesture with my arms, and Wen gave me an apologetic look. "Oh, sorry, lady. It seems we have a newcomer in town. He checked into one of the inns, instead of going up to the keep. But of course the innkeeper's wife recognized him. Apparently the innkeeper questioned him about it, but was entrusted to keep the secret." "Which naturally means the entire town now knows," said Cora, with a roll of her eyes. I gave them both a look of frustrated confusion. The loss of my voice was most infuriating at times like this. Who had arrived in Bryley, and what was he trying to keep hidden? "It turns out," Wen said, realizing my exasperation, "that Bryley's newest visitor is none other than—" A loud rapping on the door made her break off. Startled, we all exchanged glances. No one ever bothered to knock at the Haven's door. It was well known to be a refuge, open to all. "That can't be." Wen stared toward the hallway open-mouthed. "Surely that can't be—" "Well, there's only one way to find out." Cora marched toward the kitchen door. Juniper, usually boisterously friendly, seemed to have taken exception to the loud knock and had squeezed herself under her tiny table. Wen sighed and hurried over to extract her while I followed behind Cora. "Greetings," a young male voice called from the entryway. "Is anyone here?" I faltered slightly, and a crease appeared between Cora's brows. What was a young man, a stranger, apparently, doing at the Haven? This was a safe place, a refuge for women, children, and the elderly, people who had nowhere else to go. The only young or middle-aged men who came here were townsfolk bringing supplies for the inhabitants. Ash, the baker, was a regular, bringing any unsold wares at the end of the day. Cora stepped into the entryway, a commanding presence. "I am the proprietress of this establishment. May I help you?" "I hope so," he said. "I'm looking for someone, and I hear that many people find their way here." The voice sounded friendly and vaguely familiar. I stepped to the side to get a clearer view around Cora. A tall young man stood just inside the door, his stance confident but relaxed. He wore the simple but sturdy clothes of a woodsman, and he had a quiver and bow strapped to his back. I stared at his olive-toned skin, tracing the contours of his face with my eyes. His brown hair looked windswept, ruffled into small curls around his ears and the nape of his neck, and his brown eyes contained flecks of gold. Everything about him was brown and green. He looked like he belonged in the forest. If this was the newcomer, I could see how the townsfolk had immediately recognized him as out of place in the town. I didn't know why it had caused such mass concern, however. He turned to look at me, his brow creasing slightly even as he gave me an easy smile. His eyes flicked up, just above my face, and I realized that I was once again wearing the hood of my cloak, pulled forward to shield my face. I must have pulled it up without conscious thought as I followed Cora. "Sometimes the people who find their way here don't want to be found," Cora said, her voice cold. "We don't take too kindly to strangers asking questions." He didn't seem in the least flustered by her response. "But surely some who are lost want to be found?" he asked. Cora narrowed her eyes. "I suppose that depends on who's doing the finding." She let her voice trail off, the question implied. If he made a reply, I didn't hear it. Instead, I stumbled back half a step, my eyes widening. His voice had triggered my memory. He had been a gangly youth when I last saw him, although still charming. There had been a whole crowd of us, gathered for some function, and he had been intent on involving the other princes in some sort of mischief. Now that I had caught the familiar note of his voice, I could see the traces of the boy showing through in the man he had become, and suddenly I understood what had thrown the townsfolk into such confusion. This man belonged no more to the forest than he did to this remote town. He belonged in a palace, on a throne. We were talking to Crown Prince Gabriel of Talanos. Chapter 2. Something in my movements must have given me away, because both Cora and Prince Gabriel turned to look at me, interrupting whatever verbal sparring I'd missed. "Are you all right, lady?" Cora asked, remarkably calm given she was confronting her future king. "Lady?" Gabriel looked between us. "I must admit I didn't expect to find any of the local nobility here." He swept a ragged bow, far less polished than the ones I knew him to be capable of performing. So he was still attempting to pass himself off as a forester of some sort, then. If he wanted to portray himself as the kind of commoner who was overawed at the presence of minor nobility, then he should have worked on the air of confidence, which he wore more comfortably than clothes. "What?" Cora stared at him uncomprehendingly for a moment. "Lady isn't someone important," said a piping voice. "Why did you bow to her?" Juniper, who seemed to have recovered from her momentary timidity, gave Gabriel a direct stare. Wren hurried forward and swept her daughter up onto her hip, colouring as she did so. "I'm sorry, she's only young. She doesn't know what she's saying." She looked back and forth between each of us, suddenly uncertain. No one had spoken the prince's identity aloud, but the knowledge of it hung over us all, colouring our interactions. For a moment there was awkward silence, and then Gabriel blew out a quick breath. "You all know who I am, don't you?" When we all nodded, he sighed. "I suppose everyone in the town knows." Cora gave a wry chuckle. "Brierley is somewhat isolated, it's true, but the innkeeper prides himself on knowing the face of every royal and noble in the kingdom, and word travels fast in these parts. It wouldn't surprise me if half the inhabitants of the next village over know by now. Would you prefer we all start curtsying, or should we maintain the charade, Your Highness?" Gabriel gave a rueful grimace, running a hand through his hair and further ruffling the little curls. He shrugged, and then gifted us all with a broad grin. I thought maybe I was far enough away from the capital that it was worth giving it a try at least. People tend to act strangely when they know you're a prince. I can only imagine, Cora said dryly.
You're a prince?
Juniper's eyes widened. Her gaze locked on Gabriel.
A real one or a pretend one?
He chuckled. A real one, from what they tell me. Are there a great many pretend ones? She nodded.
I thought maybe they were all pretend, like dragons and giants and princesses.
Wren clucked. Princesses are real, Junie.
Are you sure?
Juniper asked, her wide-eyed face looking between each of the adults for confirmation. I bit my bottom lip and looked away, not meeting her eyes. They most certainly are, Gabriel assured her gravely. I have met many of them myself. I even have 2 sisters who are princesses. Twin sisters, in fact. Pearl and Opal. I thought of the young twins with a pang. They would be 15 by now. So grown up. Did they ever think of me and wonder about my fate? Did anyone?
And godmothers?
Juniper asked.
What about them?
Oh, they're real, I thought, but had to leave it to Gabriel to inform her that godmothers also existed. Juniper seemed to consider this before looking in my direction.
Why did the prince bow to you, lady?
She struggled in her mother's arms until Wren gave an exasperated sigh and let her slip down. Gabriel followed her progress toward me with his eyes before letting his gaze dwell curiously on my still hooded face. I could feel the questions hovering on the tip of his tongue. I wrapped an arm around the little girl's shoulders, squeezing her affectionately against my leg. I said nothing, however, and Cora answered for me. That was a misunderstanding. She turned to the prince. Lady is her nickname, not her title. No one from the local castle ever comes down to the town. As far as we know, Lord Leander dwells up there alone. He has no wife or daughters for us to call lady. What do you mean, as far as you know? Gabriel immediately latched onto the oddity. Surely he doesn't literally live alone. If he never comes down to the town, he must have servants who visit for him, to fetch food and supplies, if nothing else. Do they not gossip? He has servants, said Wren, her voice soft, but no one ever sees them in Bryley. Not since his father died 5 years ago. That sounds ominous, said Gabriel, with a laugh tinging his voice. When none of us responded in kind, or even smiled, his humour slipped away, a frown taking its place. Well, that sounds serious enough to be worth investigation, he said. Have none of you... His voice trailed away at the horrified expressions on the faces of Cora and Wren. They might be more sensible than most, but they were still citizens of Bryley. No, of course you haven't gone to have a look, he muttered to himself. I frowned at him. Hadn't he only arrived the evening before? Surely he hadn't been here long enough to understand the strange and pervasive timidity that gripped the townsfolk and rendered them impotent in the face of even the mildest threat. It is certainly curious enough that I, at least, would like to go and pay a visit to your Lord Leander, he said. I wonder if my purposes would better be served by going as myself or attempting to... His words dropped too low to be heard as he planned his best approach. I gazed at him in shock. It had been 5 years since I had seen anyone approach a potentially dangerous situation with such decisive action. I had almost forgotten how little this small forest-bound town reflected the rest of the kingdoms. His mutterings suddenly ceased, and his eyes swung up to latch onto me, as if his roving thoughts had brought him back to the other puzzle confronting him. And what exactly is Lady a nickname for? He asked. What is your full name? I sucked in a breath. This was dangerous ground. Adelaide, said Wren from behind me, a note of confusion in her voice. Her name is Adelaide, Your Highness. The prince gave a visible start and then took 2 long strides forward to push back my hood, fully exposing my face. For a moment we both stood frozen, our eyes locked together. Then his gaze broke free to rove over the rest of my features, and I heard his startled intake of air. His lips moved, forming the beginning of a word, and I didn't know if he meant to say my name or my title, but it didn't matter. In another second he would reveal everything and destroy the only refuge I had left. Habit had sealed my lips, but seeing him brought back my old self too forcibly, and I opened my mouth to cut him off. A loud honking burst from my throat, filling the entryway and sending Gabriel staggering back a step. I clasped my hands over my mouth, liquid filling my eyes. I hadn't slipped up like that in over a year. I glared at him, and something about my look must have silenced him, since his gaping mouth closed without saying a word.
"Lady, are you all right?"
Cora looked at me with concern, her eyes darting suspiciously to Gabriel. A giggle broke the tension of the moment. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the unshed tears before Juniper saw them.
"Do it again, lady! Do it again!"
Juniper bounced at my side, her eyes shining.
"You haven't done that in forever!"
I smiled at her but shook my head, consigning myself once more to muteness. Silence was far better than the only sounds I could now make.
"Do the squeak, please," she begged.
I shook my head more firmly.
"But—"
Wren scooped her up, cutting off her protest. "That is enough out of you, little miss. We're going to go check on Selina and Frank now, and I don't want to hear any more about it."
"But, Mamma,"
I heard her saying as Wren marched off down the long hall in the opposite direction to the kitchen. Gabriel finally found his voice.
"The squeak? Should I even ask?"
"Definitely not," said Cora. "Now, you said you were looking for someone, Your Highness. If I'm sure of one thing, it's that we don't have anyone here likely to have a prince looking for them."
"Are you sure about—"
Gabriel let his sentence die off when he caught the pleading look I had trained on him.
"Never mind, then. I guess I need to look elsewhere."
"Perhaps you can start at Lord Leander's keep," Cora said in a flat voice. "You seemed mighty interested in it before, and if you run across an Audrey, you can let her know that her sister misses her." Gabriel gave a bow, courtly and polished this time.
"I will certainly do so if I run across this Audrey."
But even as he said it, his eyes lingered on me. I frowned. It almost seemed as if the Crown Prince of Talanos had come here looking for me. But why would Gabriel, of all people, be searching for me? From the things I had been hearing around Briley for the last few years, Talanos had trouble enough of its own without its prince worrying about a missing Palinaran. And how had he possibly managed to track me to Briley, anyway? But the only thing harder to believe than that this royal prince had come here searching for me was the idea that there might be a second person he knew hiding in this out-of-the-way place. The silence stretched out until Cora narrowed her eyes.
"Very well, then, Your Highness.
If you're not needing anything else." She stopped short of actually ordering a prince to leave her property, but it seemed not even the presence of royalty could shake her from her assertive ways. Cora had been running the haven with open doors for so long that not even the growing timidity that infected the town seemed to have quite managed to stamp out her old nature. And one of the few positives of the townsfolk's strange attitude was that she had no need to back up her assertive manner with actual courageous action, something I feared would be beyond her. No one in Briley wanted a confrontation if they could possibly avoid it. The prince didn't seem to fit this mould, but he did agree to leave, however reluctant his manner. Only when the front door shut behind him did my tense muscles relax. I'd just arrived at the haven for the day, but all I could think about was getting back out of Briley. Would Gabriel head straight for the keep, or would he linger, hoping to talk to me? I hurried to a window that gave a clear view of the front of the lodge and peered outside. The prince stood on the street, gazing back at the building with a confused expression. I stepped to the side, out of sight, hoping he hadn't seen me. A long minute ticked by as I tried to convince myself not to look again. At last I gave in and peeked, more circumspectly this time. He was gone. I took a deep breath and stepped away from the window. Should I leave it for half an hour before making my escape, or was I better off seizing the moment now?
Lady, are you all right? I started at
Sample complete. Ready to continue?